Good evening, or good morning, or even good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. I'm Harvey Stanley, Director of Private Sales, and you're joining us here for Sealed Live. Myself and Massimo are going to count down the sale of the 500 TRC. Not any 500 TRC, it's the first 500 TRC built, and a car with an illustrious racing history, including none other than the 12 Hours of Sebring. The sale is scheduled to close in around 30 minutes' time, so you're going to be with us for 30 minutes as we talk about the car, discuss a little bit more about the wider market and the Ferrari 50 sports car scene, as well as a few other little tidbits, and then we should bring to a close in around 30 minutes. As I said, I'm joined by Massimo Delmo, Concours judge, journalist, and editor of Cavallino magazine. Good evening, Massimo.
Good evening, Harvey. Good evening, everybody.
How are you? Are you calling us from Italy?
Yes, absolutely. Now, this evening, for us this evening, I'm home. So after Cavallino Classiche in Modena and Villa d'Este, we'll spend a few days at home, already working to the new issue.
We're in the thick of the season, if you like, in Europe. The sun's out. The events are now flowing. When's your next Concours event?
Oh, let's say that in this period, Italy or very close by nations are absolutely providing a nice selection. As said, we just had Cavallino Modena and Villa d'Este, and 2 weeks from now there will be Concorso Terme della Salvarola, always in Modena. But there will be Grand Prix Classique in Monaco. There will be some races in Monza, always for classic cars. So it's really like an intense period, I would say.
Which is ironically, of course, one of the many things you can do with the 500 TRC. Yes, it's a race car, but it's also a beautiful car. So it lends itself as much to a race car. And I believe a 500 TRC is eligible for the Monaco Historic. It's certainly eligible for Le Mans Classic, of course.
That will be in 1 month from now. Exactly. That will be in 1 month from now.
Exactly. As well as clearly any number of road rallies. The Modena Centaur is very popular. It has a big anniversary year this year. Tour Auto. The list is almost endless for cars from this period, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. But not only. I would say that we saw an important change happening in the last 5 years in the classic car show of Concours of Elegances, where before there was a split division between racing cars and not racing cars. With the racing cars never considered, let's say, refined enough or beautiful enough to be selected for important trophies in Concours of Elegances. But in more recent years, we see this happening more and more, where we have ex-racing cars that enter the field and win not only the class of the racers, but even win the best of show sometimes, proving that sometimes the beauty is not only given by a specific shape, but most of the time functionality provide enough beauty for a racing cars to be considered beautiful and classy enough to win a Concours of Elegance.
I was going to save the big questions to the end, but you've teed me up. Do you think the 500 TRC is amongst the most beautiful of the 50s sports racing Ferraris?
That is a good question, and let's say that it's important considering where we are now. I believe that period racers are among the most beautiful, not only for Ferrari, but if you look even the competitors of Ferrari in that period of time, mainly Aston Martin and Maserati, you definitely have amazingly beautiful shapes. 500 TRC, if not the most beautiful, even because that could be very personal, I think could absolutely qualify among the most beautiful.
Yeah, I think if you look at a DBR1, a 500 TRC, of course, its big brother, the 335S, is a stunningly beautiful car. And even the Mercedes of that era, the Streamliner that we sold in our Motor Miami sale, is a beautiful looking car. I guess a lot of it leads down to the early introduction of some aerodynamic shapes, which do lend themselves so beautifully to those almost feminine curves that you see on cars of this era.
Once I was talking with a designer. He was head of design of Pininfarina for about 30 years, and he was telling me really how the shape of supercars, let's say this way, sports cars, change between the passage of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And so it's easy to recognize in the specific shapes of a car the period of when it was manufactured. The important thing that I would like to say is that the 500 TRC looks already as a 1960, as shape and form, while the 375 is definitely more 1950s.
Yeah. And the other thing that makes I think the TRC super beautiful and super distinctive is of course that full width windscreen. The 1956 500 TR just had just the cockpit style windshield, and then in 57 they moved to this full width windshield, which was part of the Appendix C regulations. Is that right?
Exactly. We have to consider that as more or less today, most of the shapes or the ancillaries attached to our racing cars were due to a function, for sure, but it was due to change in the rules that were making something mandatory. We see the passage of 2 seats to 1 seat back to 2 seats. We see the necessary use of a soft top of a certain kind. We see the change on windshields. We see the change of the shape of the rear lid based on what you were formerly supposed to store in your car. I think there is one of the most iconic scenes in the movie about Ford versus Ferrari, where we see the main character banging with a hammer the trunk lid of his Cobra to make space for a luggage. Of course, let's say that for sure that was a sort of Hollywoodization of the stuff, but for sure it was real. We saw cars being drastically changing the shape simply because they have to contain spare wheels or formally a luggage to be considered or accepted in a class. And the passage from a splitted windshield to a single unit is for sure linked with the new request of Appendix C.
Yeah, it's a classic case of form follows function. And am I right in thinking in that period, 57 for Le Mans, you would be required to have 2 seats, some form of roof, the full width windscreen, and was it a requirement to carry a spare wheel or at least have space for a spare wheel?
I think it was required to have the spare wheel on board.
So when you open,
and usually this created an extra work because they shape a sort of space for the spare wheel in the shape of the tank, or they simply add a few inches in height to the rear lid.
Yeah, if you open the hinged back section of the TRC, you're immediately confronted with this beautiful riveted aluminium fuel tank, which is quite a peculiar shape. It sort of slants down at the back, and I guess that peculiar shape is so that there was some room left to slide a spare wheel in the back there, inside the aluminium bodywork.
Exactly. Even because now we are talking about Le Mans, but we know for sure that the car was used in other races where to have a spare tire could have been useful.
Was the TRC used on the Mille Miglia?
57 was Mille Miglia was the last year of the Mille Miglia. So the TRC I don't think ever entered the Mille Miglia, but I can check. I have a book here, so I can easily check if it was used in Mille Miglia.
So you can see we didn't pre-rehearse these.
But
questions.
in 56, being 56, probably a 56 unit could have been inside. We can easily check.
Yeah, for sure, 500 TR definitely did the Mille Miglia.
Yeah, so. definitely.
And if the windscreen and the fuel tank are also modifications or design features to comply with regulations, actually the engine alone, the 4-cylinder 2-litre unit was also designed to comply with sports car regulations.
Definitely, yes. To answer to your first question, for sure the car is eligible because the very chassis that is for sale now was for many years in the Mille Miglia with the Italian owner, and I have fond memories of it because we are talking about the early 1990s, and this gentleman from Parma had this fantastic sports car. So I do have pictures by myself taken of this car, and I was deeply impressed by it. And I think going back to the memory could have been one of the first, if not the very first one, where I was lucky enough to sit inside. Never got a ride, but I was able of sitting inside.
I've been lucky enough to drive a particular 500 TRC up the hill at the Goodwood Festival of Speed and also on the road a little bit, and it is a very exciting experience. People traditionally always valued the V12, the bigger brother V12 Ferraris, as true Ferraris, and that a four-cylinder has always been suppressed in its value. But I think that's very unfair. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about the development of those four-cylinder and ultimately as well 6-cylinder engines, which, if I'm not mistaken, were of a very similar design, and how Enzo Ferrari came across a 4-cylinder engine as opposed to just the V12.
There was, today we have a much deeper knowledge on how everything works. And when we don't, we simply create a simulation in the computer. But back in the 1950s, you have this bunch of engineers with ideas, but the only way to prove if the ideas were right or wrong was to try physically, to build something and to try. And that is the same time where we had a 2-cylinder Ferrari engine tested on the bench. They were experimenting and they were finding interesting answers to their needs, because a V12, beside the length and the complexity, has a certain characteristics where you have higher revs, more power, but you have less torque at lower RPM. While with the 4-cylinder, you can stress a little bit more what you need at lower RPM, so to have a little bit more torque helping you out from hairpin or helping you out from super corner. That sometimes, so it's not only the pure power, but even how it is developed. Let's say during from about 5,500 to about 9,000 rep per minute.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that the 4-cylinder was only for the lower class cars. Now, clearly, a TRC was built to run in the 2-litre class, but that's a bit harsh on the 4-cylinder engine because, if I'm not mistaken, at certain tracks, Ferrari would prefer the 860 Monza over the 335S. The 860 Monza effectively being just a bigger engine than what's in the TRC, right?
But look at the racetrack they were using. Look at the road racing they were doing. But even look at the mountain championships. Ferrari back then was active in all of them. And even when we go to America, that in that part of the century begins to be an important market for Enzo Ferrari, thanks to the amazing work done by Chinetti. The racetrack were not always, let's say, were not specific an oval where the maximum speed was everything. Most of the time were very bumpy and had a sort of road configuration. So you need something to push from the bottom. And cubic capacity, of course, it's important, but you already have something that is good in 3 liters. But in the moment where you have to cope with the 2 liters capacity and you have to fulfill the technical requirement of the sports regulation, I would have been too crazy to imagine already back then going back to the smaller cylinders that you were having in the 166 with a 12-cylinder with 2 liter capacity. So the only way would have been to better use the capability of 4-cylinder. And the 6-cylinder was considered good, but as you've seen, we had more development in the 4-cylinder, even if it was more wild, because it was easier to handle, was simple to manufacture, and in a certain way was even easy to be handled by not works drivers. And indeed, we see in the history of Ferrari many four-cylinder cars doing amazing results, driven by what today we call privateer, but back then were what we call gentleman drivers.
Yeah, I've read a lot of period accounts of driving these cars, and the one thing that I think is that all of the drivers seem to pick up, particularly on the larger engined 860s and 857s, but also with the 750 Monzas and the 500s, was because of the design of the engine. There's a lot of engine braking when you come off the power. The way the engine is designed, there's also a lot of extra retardation from engine braking, which is an interesting thing that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but was a lot of the drivers said was very advantageous on courses like Dunder or Emilia.
Yeah, today it's easy to forget that brakes were an issue until a few years ago. Today you have carbon fiber discs that are usually as big as the rims with wheels of a supercar of 10 years ago, with 8 calipers and so on and so on. So you can brake 100% of the time at 100% of the performance of the brakes without having any default. But we see in the 50s some the amazing research to improve the brakes, because engineers really realized that was one of the weak points that they had. We saw the air brakes used by many manufacturers, including Mercedes, but it was not alone. We saw having fantastic pieces of art forming the drums, where to put to better cool what was inside. We see the growth of the thickness of the drums to welcome wider pads with the hope that it would have brake better. But there was no way. In the course of the race, you cannot always brake 100% of the capacity of the system, because they will simply not last. And in 3 laps, you will be out of brakes. So one of the challenge that a driver had to fulfill was to brake enough to stop and to do not lose time, but even to preserve the system, because otherwise it wouldn't have survived, forget the 24 hours, but even the 12 hours.
Yeah, of course. And in this period, the races that the manufacturers wanted to win, the races that Enzo wanted to win were long races. The races at Google were 6 hours or 9 hours long. Le Mans, of course, 24 hours. It's not a 24-hour sprint like it is today. It was a real test of endurance. And of course, this car, the first TRC, one of its first races was the 12 hours of Sebring, which is, was for sure, if I'm not wrong, probably the most important race on that side of the Atlantic. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. And is one of for sure one of the most iconic. And I don't know if you ever drove on the, let's say, tarmac, even if it's not the correct word, because we should talk more about concrete blocks that you find in Sebrings. But the track is very bumpy, and it's very challenging, not only for the drivers but for the cars too, or vice versa. Because they're always shaking in some way. And I remember once I was talking with Gino Munaroni. He was let's say a second-tier race driver. He was a Ferrari works driver with a 2 liters. Just to give you the idea, it was the last car that the Portago passed before Guidizzolo of the accident in the Mille Miglia. So he was the one passing, let's say, 10 seconds after the accident happened. And he was the one bringing the news to Brescia of the accident that happened. And he spent most of his career driving the 2 liters, in that case for the 4 cylinders. And he always said that one of the challenges that you have with the 4-cylinder cars was the fact that the car was quite strong in some components, but it suffered from the huge torque and the vibration of the engine. So you have to handle it in a certain way. That was part of the characteristic of the car. It was not something that was, the car is fantastic because of that, or the car is bad because of that. But it was one of the characteristics of the car. So you need to get used to a different approach that you usually take with the specific. But I can imagine how tough it could have been for drivers to have a TRC on the concrete in Sebring. And the fact that the car did well there proved how well it was manufactured.
Yeah. And one thing I've always wondered with the TRC is the authorities are bringing in these regulations to try and stop certainly the 2-litre class, but all these classes of racing being filled with purpose-built race cars when they were trying to keep the cars as production cars, I guess, as 2-seat cars, as cars with roof. But I always thought the TRC seemed to be Enzo's way of beating the rules and still creating a beautiful race car. And they were very, very successful in period, weren't they?
Well, I'm smiling because, you know, Enzo trying to fight the rules or try to sneak in some way out of the perfectly written rules. I think it's the trademark of Enzo for his whole career. As you know, what is the eyes defend himself, agitatore di uomini. But it's like today, you know, in Formula One, if you read the rules by the letter, you make a good car, but you don't win. You have to read between the lines. And Enzo was very good in this. And the people that he was choosing was very good in this. If you do remember Romolo Tavoni, he passed away a few years ago. He was one of the people kicked out of the famous Palace Resort in '61. But he was the team manager of Ferrari. And he was describing the continuous challenge that Enzo was imposing to the people of the racing team to do not only do well during the race, but to work incessantly to create and to give the right information to have ready a car for the new rules when the new rules will be coming out. To have an advancer, to be ready to race even if they were changing the rules. So Enzo was terrified by the fact of being caught not prepared to have something to go racing. You know, we do remember, and we just jump off many decades, but when there was the Toivonen Cresto accident in the Group B Delta S4 in Corsica, and Balestre, back then president of FIVA, decided on spot to ban Group B. Florio, that was in charge of the Lancia team, was the happiest guy on earth because Peugeot, that was his main competitor, did not have a suitable car. So back then for Enzo was the same, let's say, stress. For him, he was terrified and he was always pushing very hard on the federation because he wanted to have information in advance, to have something ready to cope with the new rules. And for him to have a V12 3 liters, a 412 a 4-cylinder 2 liters, or something that was between the two, capable of having 1 seat or 2 seats, so was always trying to have already something ready or close to be ready to keep on racing. It was his work in a certain way.
Of course.
And the F500 TRC entered exactly in this spirit.
Racing was everything for Enzo Ferrari, and this period was very much his pinnacle. And films like Race Through Mortality really show what heroes the drivers were, and they also had a great sense of camaraderie. It would have been a great time to be a racing driver in the 50s, albeit a very, very dangerous time to be a racing driver.
We can split your what you just say in three different areas of influence, let's say this way. James Hunt once answered to Sotheby Moss big balls, and whoever ever drove a racer Barquette of the period, I know exactly the definition of big balls. What does it mean? Because those cars, we tend to forget that those cars are 350, 400 of power for a weight of less than 1,000 kilos. So it's a power to weight ratio of a modern MotoGP motorcycles, and you had the suspension that in a certain way are tight, and you have brakes that today probably will be considered not enough for a e-bike, and you have tires that probably, if all four of them has less grip than half of a single modern tire. So they need, and when you are traveling at 280, 290, 300 kilometers per hour, consider the meters for every second that you are covering, and you know very well on public road most of the time that if something happened, you're gone. That was evident, and we even see the results after 60, 70, 80 years, and we know very well that unfortunately for many of them, that is exactly what happened. On the other side, Ferrari, when he established Scuderia Ferrari, we tend to forget that when he established Scuderia Ferrari, and we are talking well before Second World War, his aim was to race. He was racing with everything. We have pictures of American cars with the prancing horse sticker on the bonnet. We have a Fiat 500, the nickname Topolino or the Mickey Mouse, with the prancing horse sticker on the side. We have motorcycle. So it was really a racing team. It was a racing team. It was cashing every single potential customer willing to race to keep his Scuderia afloat. In one, we did a feature in Cavallino magazine a few issues ago about the early year of Enzo Ferrari. So the moment when he left Alfa Romeo as a racer, he became a general manager, but still more, the moment that he became the general manager of Scuderia Ferrari. And you see the passage even in the men. And there was an amazing interview of the period, of which we published a cut, because it was a very important zone that Enzo Ferrari gave, was I'm here because the cost of racing is going too high. And it's not possible, as before, for every, doesn't matter how wealthy it is, gentleman driver, to be completely alone on the race field. The aim of my Scuderia is simply putting together the needs of 4, 5, 10 gentleman drivers and support them on the racing field. And doing so, allowing them to share a certain kind of expenses. So the vision was very, very clear. And for him, racing was really everything.
Yes. I'm gonna interrupt you there a little bit because we're now into the last 2 minutes before this auction lot closes. For those of you who aren't familiar with the with sealed, the way it works is bids are anonymous. There is no buyer's premium. So really, the buyer, the bidder, is empowered to bid, and he can bid whatever he likes. So it doesn't matter what the number, it doesn't matter what the previous bid is, because the bidder amounts are confidential. The bidder is invited at this stage, with now less than 2 minutes to go, to make any bid they like. Once that bid has been placed, you then find yourself in a leaderboard. So if perhaps you've been a little bit sensible with your bid, you might find yourself down in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, or maybe even 10th place. As you perhaps build your confidence and up your bid, you start to climb that leaderboard. Now, the aim of the game, obviously, is to end at number 1 on that leaderboard when the timer ticks down. If, however, as we near the end of this sale, if, however, a bid comes in right at the end there that changes the order of the top 3, then there is an auto extend function which allows the auction to go on for around another minute, enabling those top 3, but also anybody in the leaderboard, to increase their bids. It stops somebody coming in at the very last minute and sort of sniping the bid there. So we're now really counting down to the last few seconds of this. I'm going to have a look on my screen here and see if we're going to auto extend. We've had between 10 and 15 bids now in the last just in the last 10 minutes as we've been talking about it. There's been a real flurry of interest. Another bid's just come in now, which has perhaps triggered that auto extend. So if you are bidding and you're a little bit confused as to why it's not ending straight away, that's because if one of those bids comes in up there in the top third, in those top three, that does extend the auction for a little bit longer. I'm just looking here and I can see there's been, as I say, quite a few bids. I can't say too much about what they are, but they're all quite close to each other. So if you're bidding and you've suddenly found yourself dropping from second, third, or fourth down the order, it's definitely worth digging deep and putting in that final bid. You can bid.
You know, I was thinking right now of when Ed Gilbertson, the founding of ICJack, told me that back in the, let's say, mid 1970s, he was living in San Francisco, and he was waiting for the Chronicle going out on the Sunday morning edition, because there were the classified for the cars. And once he was willing to buy a 250 short wheelbase, and you know, he went to see one car, and he said the request was $10,000. That back then was the standard price for every used Ferrari. $10,000 can buy you any used Ferrari. And I saw this car was 10,000 and 250, was a little bit scruffy, not well serviced, some dents on the body. So I went to see another one, and it was 1,050, and they say this one looks better, is better kept, and so I bought the second one, without thinking that the first one was a competition with another body, but the price was exactly the same. And while you were saying this about the bidding, I was thinking if my $10,000 bid is able of putting me in the top three or not yet.
$10,000 doesn't put you in the top three, unfortunately.
Maybe four. Maybe I'm fourth. Okay, thank you.
It doesn't even get you close. Perhaps you're forgetting that this is the Sebring 12-hour 500 TRC. It's the first 500 TRC. It's one of only three 500 TRCs that has that super masculine looking louver on the front wing there. It's also Classic A certified and certified no less as matching numbers components throughout. It's also a car that Ferraris, and certainly I always find people maybe less experienced with Ferrari, always think a Ferrari should be red. Now, this car was delivered red, and of course it is red now, but like a lot of cars of the era, it went through a number of different owners, a number of different race teams, and it wore a huge number of different liveries throughout the years. I was scrolling through the history earlier and looking at some period pictures, and I thought how cool it would be if the new owner of the car wanted to return the car to the dark blue with that very cool white stripe that went up the middle. But that's the thing with these 50s cars, because they had such rich lives, there's many options there for the new owner to almost put their own mark on the car by bringing it back to one of these specifications. And as a concourse judge, I'm sure you'd love to see the car back in one of its alternative racing liveries.
It's always interesting looking at the liveries of the cars, because sometimes there are some that are really iconic. When you look the Nart racing team with his white and blue that is coming from the Paravano car in a certain way.
Yes.
Or you look some with the Curie Francorchamps one, or the Ronnie Hoare colors with the stripes. So it's amazing how history is linked sometimes with a livery.
Yeah, exactly. How important is Classic A certification on cars like this now for buyers and collectors in this era we're in with the market?
But today Ferrari start to be recognized by chassis numbers. Then now is that is the starting point. You go up digging on the body number or the panels numbers or the differential numbers, the gearbox numbers. We tend to forget that back then the shop was not the most organized things in the world, meaning that when you are entering a racing car, if you need a gearbox that is working and you have one already, you put inside without taking too much care if it's the matching number one or not. You just need to find a solution, you move forward. But today the Ferrari Classiche certification allowed you as a buyer to feel safe, because somebody that is of course very competent and has the archive with written down what was in which car tell you, this car is correct because of this number, or we know that is correct for this race, and so on and so on. So allow the buyer to feel safer by this point of view, because he knows that already in a certain way certified by somebody that has the competence for doing so.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate the importance of that that peace of mind, and also that 50s racing cars are not black and white. They live very exciting lives, and nothing can be neither totally original nor totally the other way. But it is great to have a certification program that allows owners to almost, or prospective owners, to have a bit of a clearer sense of what on the car is original and what isn't, especially when a lot of restorers are also dealers. So to have that independent Ferrari-backed certification program, I think, has been a huge driving factor into why the Ferrari brand and cars from this era, from Maranello, have absolutely proved far better investments than cars from other marques. And I do think the support we have from Classiche and is certainly one of the reasons why Ferraris continue to be the best performing classic cars, certainly of this era.
It's a question of knowledge. More knowledge there is, more you feel safe of putting a certain amount of money in buy a classic car, because you know that what is there is exactly what is supposed to be there. So you feel safe, and everything is more straightforward. You have less doubt that we know to be, usually having a good impact the decision to move forward with a purchase or not. So if the fact that the most important Ferrari in the world, they have the Ferrari Classiche certification, probably it means that the market recognizes it as a valuable reference tool.
Yeah. Do you think it's a big value add? Do you think it's important that this is the first 500 TRC?
Of course, it adds a certain coolness to the car to be the first. It's always something special. Probably the main benefit is the fact that we can really imagining the work done by the coach builder and Enzo Ferrari visiting him in the definition of the shapes, because we have to remember that the body of this car was not designed on a piece of paper and then created in real. But Enzo was sending the rolling chassis, and the coach builder was providing a body fitting it and respecting the racing rules. So, and Enzo was going visiting the shop every morning. So we know very well that for sure we had a lot of eyes of important people looking at this body, because it was the first one. And as I say, it had a certain kind of exclusivity and coolness. Even if, when the decision was taken to manufacture usually a very small series of the cars, chassis number 2 and 3 and 4 is not that are, oh my God, they are terrible because I'm not number 1. But I would say that the number 1 is the number 1.
Yeah. There's always a certain cachet about being the first anything, and no more so than being the first to finish a race. And whilst this car didn't win Sebring, it did go on to win a load of races through America, and then like a lot of cars at that period ended up in the Bahamas at Nassau, which was sort of always seems to me like a bit of a end of season party for the drivers. It always looks like they had quite a lot of fun in the Bahamas, but there was a lot of racing that went on down there, and it was all the great drivers were in Nassau. Fangio, of course, Fangio was famously kidnapped in the Bahamas, but Sterling Moss and all the who's who.
Everybody was going there. Today, we think, you are a Formula One race car driver, you make an amazing quantity of money every year, and this is exactly what you race with. But back then, drivers were paid race by race in a certain way. So to have the possibility to have an income, even when the season in Europe was over, for them was very important. And as you say, it was a sort. The racing in the Bahamas was a sort of party for everybody. Before there was the stop in Miami, and then everybody was flying there, and they were racing, and they were living the life. They were in their early 20s, They were living a very exciting life. They were full of life and joy for living. So they were simply taking their chance at the best. And we know that Peter Collins met his wife just a few days in Miami before going to Nassau. So they stopped there in Miami and then Bahamas. It was rich of interesting meetings.
Yeah, I think
Willis Collins was working in Miami back then.
I think Sterling Moss probably takes the trophy for having the most fun at these events of all the drivers. He certainly always seems to have had a grin on his face. Now there's been more jostling in the bidding. We've had a number now of auto extensions. If I look at the time, we must have had something like 10 or 15 bids since effectively that closing. So, like I said, when bids keep happening in the top part of the leaderboard there, it adds another extension on. So that's why, if you're wondering why this hasn't closed yet, that's why. So we've had a number of bids, not giving too much away. They're not all new bidders. There's a number of people improving their bid, being outbid, improving again. And that's the exciting thing about sealed is you don't know exactly what the other bidders are, but it invites you, like I said earlier, it invites you to make the best bid you can, to make the bid that you feel the car is worth. And if that doesn't, unlike a live auction where you have an auctioneer who effectively is asking you a question, the next bid is 1.2 or 1.3, and you can only answer yes, I bid, or no, or if you're very cheeky, you might cut the bid in half. But they're your only options. With sealed, you can put any number in that box you like and click place bid. So that's certainly an advantage for the buyer, and for the seller, of course, this confidentiality is often very, very important for both buyer and seller. Perhaps you like to buy or sell your cars in a scenario that means that not everybody knows what you've bought or sold the car for. So sealed is working very well for us. We had our sealed drop, our May sealed drop just before this 500 TRC. We had a wonderful collection of more modern cars, as well as a Singer and a Bentley. I think we may now be reaching the end of the bidding. I can see here on my screen we've got under a minute to run. It looks to me like, although these bids do keep coming in, we might have a few bidders dropping out. We might just be reaching the end of this process. Like I said, it's about 30 seconds to go now. There's been good bidding at the end, but I feel like maybe this is last chance saloon. So if you were going to bid, or you have been bidding and you've been waiting to bid at the last second, this last second is, as I said, of course, we have another bid up there in the top part of the leaderboard. So the other interesting thing about sealed is because we have 90 seconds countdown between bids, there's a bit more thinking time than there is in a live auction. In that live auction setting, you certainly don't have 90 seconds to make a decision. So it's interesting the way the bidding patterns change in this sealed platform. I'm just watching now, and there's still some action going on. Let me see if I can click back to my screen and see where we're at. Yeah, of course. Yeah, we might even have a new bidder at the top of the leaderboard.
Okay.
So some fresh bids coming in. As I scroll down now, since we came on air, there must be 30 or 35 bids. So again, generally in a live auction, there wouldn't be anywhere near that number of bids on a car like this. So yeah, we are counting down again, perhaps waiting for yet another bid to take us on. My clock is showing under 30 seconds now. In fact, under 20 seconds now. Perhaps this is where we close. 10, 9, 8, 7. Of course.
Another one. That's
another,
wonderful.
It goes on and on and on. Since this doesn't feel like it's going to come to a conclusion anytime soon, as people keep fighting over who wants to take home this 500 TRC.
I would say that is a good sign. I would say that is a good sign, And this proves that good, interesting cars, they always have a nice bunch of people willing to have them in their garage, So it's interesting. It's beautiful to see so much action. probably when we decide that it's time to go home and stop the podcast, we start to say the problem of having a four-cylinder Ferrari. So, for example, that if you wake up for a ride at 5 in the morning, and you decide to go off, you wake up all your neighbors because your soundtrack will keep everybody up in the alpha mile space between you and everybody else. But the sound that they make are absolutely gorgeous.
As we again wind down potentially to the last bids, can we offer the lucky new owner of this car an article in Cavallino magazine? And is that something you can help us with, Massimo?
That is a nice question to put down on the table at this point. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it with the new owner and see if he's interested. Why not? We can talk about it.
And your role is, your day job effectively is editor-in-chief of Cavallino?
Yes.
So does that obviously, I guess that covers the event side of things in terms of curation, selection committee, and judging, as well as what the magazine produces.
Yes, definitely. And we usually have two main features for every issue. One is dedicated to Ferrari, of course, up to 1967 in a certain way. And then we have a second main feature with the same amount of space that is dedicated to Ferrari manufactured after 1967. For example, in the last two issues, we had the one that is coming out right now because it's for sale from tomorrow is a 599 GTB Fiorano on the cover. Yes. And the issue before we had an F50, for example. So we really have the will to cover the two worlds, so the classic and the youngtimer. And then we always have an interesting link to the main features, where we go deeper in a specific topic of the car, of the model. And for example, in this case, we had for the 599, we have an interview with who designed the car, and we have the never seen before story of how the prototype was manufactured, the passage from paper to production. It is always a very unknown process. And then there is the coverage of the events, of course, are very important. And in the poor style of Cavallino, when we do cover an event, we always publish all the chassis numbers of every single Ferrari that was attending. And this is what made Cavallino great since 1978, because every single Ferrari, every picture, every single note that was in Cavallino always identified the car not as a Ferrari model, but as a Ferrari model chassis number. And that creates a database that is spectacular, because we see today people looking for the history of a special chassis, and they can find where the car was in 78, 83, 94.
And so when was Cavallino founded?
1978. That was the first issue. So that is the magazine. While the concourse came out, the first concourse was organized in 1992. But the magazine was first published at the end of 1978. Is the famous cover, the black cover with the mosaic Cavallino shield on the cover.
Is that issue number 1, that famous cover?
Yes, that is issue number 1. And when we celebrate our anniversary, we did the interview with the guy who had the idea back then he had the Cavallino mosaic, and he gifted it after to Enzo Ferrari. So it's interesting to see that, and Enzo Ferrari hung it on the fireplace in the Fiorano house. So if you look at Enzo Ferrari and the interview done to him for 20 years in the house in Fiorano, there is always the Cavallino shield hanged on his fireplace. And the Cavallino still today is on the ownership of the family, of the Ferrari family. Brilliant. And it's something that we are quite proud of, if you think about it.
Absolutely. Now, whilst we've been talking there, again, there's been more bids, but I can confirm that the sale has now closed. Everybody's given their best bids, and so now I can confirm the bidding is closed. and the bidding has ended rather, and the sale is closed. That went. We find often with these sealed sales, they do go on a little bit beyond the deadline as people jostle and between themselves decide who's worthy of ending that leaderboard in the number one position. If you're enjoying this and want to listen to more content from us at RM, we have a podcast. We're just about to start a new season. We recorded some content in Milan where we were for our auction last week. But by all means, if you are a fan of podcasts, wherever you subscribe to those, you should make an effort to join our new podcast season. I think
what you get with the Ferrari is 12 cylinders more of anxiety, isn't it?
Yeah, what are we talking about?
You crazy English people.
Sometimes I own cars that I really shouldn't own because I can't afford to own them. If anything goes wrong on this car,
yes,
I'm sunk.
Hashtag just drive it.
And I came so close to what I felt was a moment where I could have died.
Quite traumatic.
It was, and I just sat there.
Did you get out and say, that's an amazing car?
How much of this is going to go out? Oh, it's live.
It's live, actually.
Too late.
So yeah, that's the new season of the RM Sotheby's car show, our podcast. So wherever you get your podcast, whether that's Spotify, YouTube, do subscribe and follow the team through the summer season of events. Peter normally is the host of that show and does a fantastic job. So if you are into your podcast, definitely give us a subscribe. So as we sort of wrap up now, Massimo, what's next for you on the calendar? Where will we see you next?
First will be 2 weeks from now in close to Modena for Salvarola, for Terme della Salvarola Concourse of Elegance. And then, of course, in August, I will be in Pebble Beach, Monterey Week.
Of course. And coming up for us as RM, we have our live auction-wise, we have clearly Monterey is the big feature in America. Before that, we have an online sale in North America. So if you haven't already started to check that out, or I think there's still time to consign if you're thinking of selling, by all means get in touch with your specialist. And then at Cliveden House in the UK, we have our summer UK sale, which is marks the sort of halfway point, although it's a bit closer to winter before our Peninsula sale, which takes place in November. And we're excited to announce that we'll also be having a sale in the Middle East closer to the end of the year, as we did last year, which have been very, very successful and attract buyers both from the region but also from around the world. Massimo, thank you so much for joining us. It's been fascinating to pick your brain a little bit on 50 sports car, Lampredi engines, Mille Miglia, and many other things. To those of you watching, thanks for joining us, and to those of you who've been bidding on the 500 TRC, thank you very much again for being a part of this journey and being a part of the Seal platform, which just seems to go from strength to strength. Thank you, Massimo.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
This is without